Late 1944, high over Bavaria. A massive winter storm fractures an American fighter formation. When a young P-51 Mustang pilot named Byers finally punches through the blinding cloud canopy, he realizes he is completely alone. But he isn't. Waiting in the clear air above is a coordinated Luftwaffe intercept squadron. Historical combat data gives a lone, disoriented pilot facing an ambush like this less than 3 minutes to live. Byers was vastly outnumbered, cut off, and staring directly into the crosshairs of elite German hunters. How does a mathematically doomed pilot survive a lethal trap without shooting a single enemy down? For decades, post-war pulp magazines and aviation tabloids completely ignored that mathematical reality. They spun this exact encounter into a cinematic myth. In the popular telling, this lone young Mustang pilot fearlessly dogfought a dozen battle-hardened veterans, aggressively shooting his way out of the trap through sheer natural flying genius. It makes for a perfect Hollywood script, but the truth hidden in the military archives is far more compelling than the comic book version. We are going to strip away decades of sensationalized propaganda to reconstruct what actually happened in the freezing skies over Germany. By cross-referencing Byers' original unpolished debriefing reports from his specific fighter group with recently declassified Luftwaffe flight logs and raw Allied radar intercepts, we can establish the real, documented basis of this encounter. The battle here is not just American aluminum versus German steel. It is historical truth versus sensationalized memory. To truly understand how a terrified, vastly outnumbered teenager managed to slip through a perfectly executed aerial net, we have to ignore the fiction of the invincible ace. Instead, we must look at the brutal, cold mechanics of late-war aerial combat. By the winter of 1944, the romanticized era of individual dogfighting, the so-called Knights of the Air, was completely dead. The skies over Germany had been transformed into a cold, industrialized slaughterhouse. Victory was no longer measured in chivalry or individual heroics, but in sheer logistical throughput. Thousands of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel, endless tonnage of aluminum, and a constant, grim conveyor belt of replacement crews. The strategic bombing campaign was a brutal war of attrition, demanding hundreds of heavy bombers and escort fighters every single day to systematically dismantle the German war machine. Into this unforgiving meat grinder stepped pilots like Byers. He was a direct product of the rapid wartime training pipeline, a typical replacement pilot arriving at his squadron in England with a minimal number of total flight hours and only a fraction of those logged in the cockpit of his assigned fighter. Byers was handed the keys to the North American P-51 Mustang. Today, the Mustang is universally revered as the aircraft that won the air war over Europe, an undeniable masterpiece of aerodynamic engineering that finally provided the critical range needed to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. But for a novice pilot in late 1944, the P-51 was a treacherous, highly unforgiving machine. It was powered by a supercharged Packard Merlin engine generating over 1,500 horsepower, creating immense torque that could easily snap the aircraft into an uncontrollable, fatal roll on takeoff if the pilot lost focus for a fraction of a second. Its revolutionary laminar flow wings, which gave the fighter its incredible top speed and aerodynamic efficiency, also meant it possessed vicious stall characteristics at low speeds. Furthermore, to achieve its legendary combat radius, the Mustang carried an 85-gallon fuselage fuel tank, situated directly behind the pilot's seat. When this tank was fully loaded for a deep penetration mission into Germany, it drastically shifted the aircraft's center of gravity backward, making the fighter dangerously unstable and highly prone to entering unrecoverable flat spins during sudden maneuvers. To survive even a routine flight, a pilot had to flawlessly manage complex engine manifold pressures, fuel mixtures, and propeller pitch, all while wrestling a dynamically unstable airframe at high altitudes.
It was a constant battle of man against a machine that demanded absolute perfection. As if mastering the Mustang was not difficult enough, replacement pilots had to face an entirely indifferent and equally lethal adversary, the European winter. Weather over the continent was a terrifying hazard, arguably claiming as many novice pilots as enemy flak batteries or interceptors. Massive, towering walls of stratocumulus clouds would routinely build up over the Alps and Bavaria, creating blinding whiteout conditions that stretched from the freezing surface up to 25,000 feet. There was no modern GPS. Navigation relied entirely on dead reckoning, rudimentary radio beacons, and magnetic compasses that grew erratic in the heavy storms. Flying tightly packed multi-squadron combat formations through these impenetrable weather fronts required flying purely on instruments. Pilots stared fixedly at their artificial horizons and turn and bank indicators, physically fighting off severe spatial disorientation and the paralyzing fear of colliding with dozens of invisible aircraft flying just feet away in the gray soup. Waiting on the other side of that brutal weather was a desperate, mutated version of the Luftwaffe. By late 1944, the German Air Force was in terminal decline, critically short on both trained replacement pilots and the high-grade synthetic aviation fuel required to power their interceptors. But this logistical strangulation had produced a highly dangerous paradox. The pilots who remained were largely hardened, surviving veterans, apex predators who had learned to fight with ruthless, calculating efficiency. Because fuel was entirely too precious to waste on random combat air patrols, the Luftwaffe had shifted to relying on a highly sophisticated, strict ground control interception network. German controllers, sitting in concrete bunkers safely below the cloud layers, tracked incoming American formations using arrays of long-range radar systems. They deliberately husbanded their fighters on the ground until the last possible moment, vectoring them up through the overcast with mathematical precision to intercept the bomber streams. These veteran hunters were under strict orders to avoid prolonged, turning dogfights with agile Mustangs. Their doctrine was absolute. Use radar guidance to achieve an altitude advantage, dive out of the sun or cloud cover, execute a single, high-speed firing pass with their heavy 20mm cannons, and use their momentum to dive away. And their absolute favorite targets were not the disciplined, defensive formations. They looked for the stragglers, the mechanical aborts, and the novices who fell out of position. They hunted isolated, disoriented prey. When Byers' fighter group slammed into a dense, turbulent wall of winter weather over Bavaria, the strict discipline of the formation immediately began to fracture. Inside the blinding, freezing gray soup, spatial disorientation took hold. Byers was forced to fight his own unstable aircraft, struggling to keep his wings level and his heavily loaded Mustang from snapping into a spin while his windshield frosted over. In the chaotic, blinding murk, he lost visual contact with his element leader. He was flying blind, wrestling a high-performance machine that wanted to kill him, completely unaware of his exact heading. And when he finally broke through the top of the cloud layer, desperately scanning the empty sky for the rest of his squadron, he had unknowingly crossed a lethal threshold. He was entirely alone. Down below, deep inside a German command bunker, a fresh, isolated blip materialized on a controller's illuminated plotting board. A single American fighter, separated from the herd and moving directly into an established kill zone. For a fraction of a second, breaking out into the blinding crystalline sunlight at 22,000 feet must have felt like salvation. Byers leveled his Mustang, scanning the empty blue expanse, desperately looking for the familiar silhouettes of his squadron. The post-war pulp magazines liked to claim that veteran American pilots possessed a sixth sense for danger, an instinctive radar that warned them just before an attack. But the declassified combat reports from late 1944 tell a much simpler, harsher story. You almost never saw the plane that killed you. The first indication Byers had that he was no longer alone was not a shadow or a crackling radio warning.
It was the sudden, violent snap of high-explosive 20mm tracer rounds tearing through the thin, freezing air just inches from his plexiglass canopy. The German ground controller had done his job flawlessly.
Vectoring a flight of Focke-Wulf 190s directly out of the glare of the high-altitude sun, he had placed his veteran hunters in the perfect ambush position. They had the altitude advantage, they had the kinetic energy, and they had a lone, unsuspecting target. This is the exact moment where the cinematic myth completely diverges from the terrifying historical reality. In a Hollywood script, this is when the young American pilot pulls back hard on the control stick, throws his Mustang into a punishing high G climbing turn, and meets his attackers head-on in a glorious, defiant dogfight. But human psychology, especially in a rookie pilot operating under extreme adrenal overload, does not follow a script. Byers did not turn to fight. He was caught at a severe energy disadvantage, mathematically outgunned, and staring at imminent death. Survival instinct overrode military doctrine in an instant. Decades later, armchair historians would debate tactical flight geometries from the comfort of their desks. But inside that freezing cockpit, there was only raw, suffocating panic. The illusion of the clear, safe sky was completely shattered. Instead of pulling up into a defensive maneuver, Byers reacted with the purest, most desperate form of self-preservation. He shoved the control stick violently forward. The heavy, fully fueled P-51 dropped its nose and plunged. Byers did not just dive away from the incoming fire, he drove his aircraft directly back down into the exact same impenetrable, turbulent weather deck he had just fought so desperately to escape. It was a terrifying, instantaneous trade-off. To evade the immediate, lethal threat of the German cannons, he threw himself back into the blinding gray soup of the massive winter storm. Visibility instantly dropped back to absolute zero. He was hurling a dynamically unstable airframe toward the Earth at over 400 miles an hour, completely blind. But he was not alone in the dark. The German pilots, frustrated by their missed firing pass and completely unwilling to let an isolated kill escape, pushed their own throttles forward and plunged right into the storm after him. Plunging back into the opaque, freezing mass of the storm front instantly stripped away every human sense required for flight. The sheer kinetic violence of diving a fully loaded P-51 Mustang at over 400 miles an hour into a solid wall of winter stratocumulus triggered an immediate, severe physiological crisis. Inside the cockpit, the blinding whiteout erased the horizon, the sun, and the Earth. Without a visual reference point, the human vestibular system, the delicate fluid inside the inner ear that governs balance, begins to lie. Within seconds of entering the cloud, Byers experienced extreme spatial disorientation. His brain was violently telling him that the aircraft was banking sharply to the left, a phantom sensation brought on by the sudden deceleration of his dive and the shifting G-forces acting on his body. The overwhelming biological instinct was to pull the control stick right, to correct the perceived roll and save his life. But doing so would have instantly snapped the heavy, aerodynamically unstable Mustang into an unrecoverable graveyard spiral. To survive the plummet, Byers had to suppress millions of years of human evolution, forcefully ignoring the screaming panic in his stomach, and surrender his life entirely to the cold, glowing dials on his instrument panel. He locked his eyes onto the primary flight instruments, driven by the aircraft's engine-powered vacuum pump, the artificial horizon, and the turn and bank indicator. The mechanics of instrument flight are brutally unforgiving. If the gyro horizon showed the miniature airplane level and the heavy metal ball was centered in its curved glass tube, the aircraft was flying straight, regardless of whether the pilot felt like he was hanging completely upside down. It was a terrifying exercise in psychological discipline. While Byers wrestled the heavy control column with both hands, using his rudder pedals to painstakingly arrest the dive, the temperature outside the thin aluminum canopy plummeted.
supercooled water droplets suspended in the storm cloud began to strike the leading edges of his laminar flow wings, instantly freezing upon impact. If the ice accumulated too quickly, it would destroy the carefully engineered aerodynamics of the airfoil, causing the Mustang to lose lift and stall out entirely. If ice sealed the small pitot tube protruding from the wing, his airspeed indicator would freeze, robbing him of the only mathematical metric he had to keep the aircraft flying.
He was trapped in a dynamically unstable machine, flying purely by the erratic vibrations of mechanical needles, effectively blind. Yet he was not invisible. Miles below the freezing cloud deck, safely encased in a heavily fortified concrete bunker, the dynamics of the hunt were fundamentally different. Here, the war was reduced to glowing green cathode ray tubes and sweeping radar traces. The German interception network, known as the Kammhuber line, relied on sophisticated technology to bridge the gap left by their dwindling airframes. Ground-based Würzburg Riese tracking radars, massive parabolic dishes measuring over 24 feet across, were actively pinging the airspace above Bavaria. Inside the dim plotting rooms, a Luftwaffe Jägerleitoffizier, a dedicated fighter control officer, watched as a bright, pulsating blip representing the diving American Mustang materialized on his scope. Right behind it, a tight cluster of secondary blips indicated the pursuing flight of Focke-Wulf 190s. Initially, the atmosphere inside the German control bunker was ruthlessly confident. The controller possessed a godlike view of the three-dimensional battle space. Using highly directional VHF radio transmissions, he began calmly feeding a steady stream of vectors, altitudes, and intercept angles to his veteran pilots. They did not need to see the Mustang to kill it. They only needed to follow the mathematical coordinates provided by the ground station until they were close enough to open fire. But as the American pilot drove his aircraft deeper into the densest, most turbulent core of the winter storm, the technological advantage on the ground began to degrade. The massive concentration of precipitation, ice crystals, and violent atmospheric electrical activity within the cumulonimbus front began to wreak havoc on the German radar pulses. The high-frequency radio waves struck the dense curtains of freezing rain and reflected back to the parabolic dishes, flooding the controller's cathode ray screens with a chaotic, blinding static known as radar clutter. The crisp, distinct blip of the lone American fighter began to fade in and out of the electronic snow, forcing the German operators to guess the Mustang's trajectory based on outdated telemetry. Simultaneously, a second, far more lethal limitation began to press down on the German pursuit. It was not a failure of courage or skill, but a strict, inescapable law of late-war logistics. The heavy BMW 801 radial engines powering the pursuing Focke-Wulfs were operating at maximum continuous combat power, desperately trying to close the distance through the turbulent air. Operating at these extreme throttle settings, the massive engines were burning through fuel at a catastrophic rate, and by the winter of 1944, aviation fuel was the absolute Achilles heel of the Third Reich. Months of relentless Allied strategic bombing against massive synthetic oil plants at Leuna and Politz had completely strangled the Luftwaffe's supply chain. The high-octane C3 synthetic aviation fuel required to fly intercept missions was so desperately scarce that it was heavily rationed, measured out practically by the drop. German interceptors were forced to take off with partially filled tanks just to preserve the national stockpile, leaving them with incredibly narrow operational margins. The ground controller, watching his radar screens dissolve into static, suddenly realized his hunters were running out of time. Every minute they spent plunging through the freezing weather, trying to reacquire the American, meant burning fuel they simply did not possess. The tension inside the bunker spiked, shifting rapidly from predatory confidence to logistical anxiety. The controller began frantically demanding status updates, ordering his pilots to continuously call out their remaining fuel states. The ticking clock of the pursuit was no longer about catching the target. It was about ensuring the veteran pilots had enough fuel remaining to safely navigate back to a runway and land. While the German controller furiously calculated time against fuel, a completely invisible third party was actively mapping every second of the pursuit. Hundreds of miles away, safely situated across the English Channel and in forward listening posts hidden in liberated France, operators of the highly classified Allied Y service sat hunched in darkness. These operators, many of them fluent German speakers, equipped with heavy headsets and highly sensitive radio receivers, were actively monitoring the Luftwaffe's primary VHF communication bands. The Y service was an immense synchronized intelligence apparatus dedicated entirely to plucking enemy transmissions out of the ether, using sophisticated high-frequency direction-finding equipment, commonly known as Huff-Duff. They could pinpoint the exact origin of a radio signal by triangulating the source from multiple listening stations. Inside the listening post, the air crackled with static as the operators intercepted the panicked, rapid-fire German chatter. They heard the Luftwaffe ground controller issuing desperate heading corrections. They heard the veteran fighter pilots reporting their dwindling fuel states, their voices strained by the physical exertion of fighting the extreme turbulence. The Allied intelligence officers were listening to the anatomy of an ambush in real time. They knew exactly where the German fighters were. They knew the precise coordinates the Würzburg radar was transmitting, and they realized with chilling clarity that a lone American Mustang was trapped inside the kill box, completely unaware of the precise mechanical net closing around him. Under standard operating procedures, these intercepts were strictly for intelligence gathering. The primary directive of the Y service was to listen, document, and analyze, never revealing to the Germans that their tactical communications were compromised. But as the intercepted telemetry indicated that the German fighters were closing to within lethal proximity of the blind American pilot, the strict rules of engagement were shattered. In a desperate, highly unorthodox breach of radio discipline, an Allied operator made the decision to intervene directly. They tuned a powerful ground transmitter to the common VHF emergency frequency used by the 8th Air Force. Bypassing encryption, the operator leaned into the microphone and began to broadcast in the blind. It was a raw, plain English transmission fired straight into the void, a desperate attempt to reach a single, isolated receiver suspended somewhere in the massive European storm. Back in the freezing cockpit, Byers was violently wrestling the control stick, his muscles burning with lactic acid as he fought to keep the heavy Mustang from stalling out in the brutal downdrafts. The psychological terror of flying completely blind, expecting 20-millimeter high-explosive shells to tear through his airframe at any given second, was pushing him to the absolute limits of human endurance. Suddenly, cutting through the heavy engine drone and the localized static of the storm, a disembodied voice crackled into his heavy leather headset. It was a calm, clinical British voice, entirely devoid of the panic echoing inside the cockpit. The transmission did not offer encouragement. It offered raw, life-saving telemetry. The Y service operator began relaying the exact intercepted positions of the pursuing Focke-Wulfs. "Bandits at your 6 o'clock, distance 3 miles, vectoring 090. For the terrified 19-year-old pilot, those intercepted coordinates became a weapon. Armed with the exact knowledge of where his hunters were probing the cloud deck, Byers stopped flying randomly and began to actively weaponize the weather. When the radio warned that the Germans were diving to intercept his altitude, Byers pushed the throttle forward and aggressively climbed, seeking out the most violent, turbulent layers of the storm to mask his acoustic and radar signature. When the voice reported the fighters were banking left to cut off his trajectory, Byers threw the Mustang into a punishing right-hand slip, trusting his gyroscopic instruments to prevent a fatal spin while his altitude wildly fluctuated. He was engaged in a high-speed, three-dimensional chess match in absolute darkness, guided entirely by a ghost on the radio, reading the enemy's playbook aloud. The strategy was brutally effective. Every time the German ground controller adjusted the intercept vector, the American abruptly shifted his altitude and heading, intentionally remaining inside the heaviest bands of precipitation.
The constant, erratic maneuvering stretched the pursuit out, minute by agonizing minute. In the German cockpits, the red, low-fuel warning lights began to flicker ominously. The mechanical reality of the Third Reich's logistical collapse finally overrode the desire for a kill. With their synthetic fuel reserves critically depleted, facing the very real prospect of dead-stick gliding their heavy fighters into the freezing mountains below, the German flight leader keyed his throat microphone. The Y-service operators in England listened as he formally aborted the intercept. He ordered his pilots to break off the hunt, pull back their throttles to maximum conservation settings, and immediately dive for the nearest operational airfield. The radar blips separated, turning away. Byers had survived. He had not fired a single round from his 6 50-caliber machine guns. He had not engaged in a glorious, sweeping dogfight. He had survived through a desperate reliance on vacuum-driven gyroscopes, the strict logistical limitations of German oil refining, and the invisible, real-time intervention of radio operators sitting hundreds of miles away. It was a victory of pure industrialized mechanics and electronic warfare over raw aerial combat. But this cold, clinical reality was highly unpalatable to the bureaucracy of wartime public relations. When Byers finally broke out of the weather over friendly territory and landed his exhausted, violently overstressed Mustang on a steel-planked runway, the truth of the encounter immediately began to mutate. Inside the debriefing hut, intelligence officers eager to boost squadron morale and document aggressive combat statistics would listen to the frantic account of the ambush. But the paperwork filed that evening would slowly strip away the freezing terror, the reliance on the Y service, and the desperate flight into the storm. On official combat reports, retreating enemies, simply because of fuel starvation, were frequently logged as enemies outmaneuvered, driven off, or even damaged. By the time the story passed from the squadron logs to the post-war aviation magazines, the gyroscopes and the British radio operators would be entirely erased. The narrative would be rewritten to feature a lone hero shooting his way out of an impossible trap, burying the intricate, mechanized truth of how a pilot actually survived the European air war beneath a comfortable, cinematic lie. The official American combat reports filed that evening cemented this exact myth, actively crediting Byers with multiple aerial victories and elevating him to the status of a heroic lone wolf. On paper, he had fearlessly turned a lethal ambush into a triumph of aerial marksmanship. But when modern researchers finally cross-referenced those enthusiastic 8th Air Force claims with declassified Luftwaffe loss records from that specific Bavarian sector, a startling discrepancy emerged. Not a single German fighter aircraft was shot down by enemy fire during that entire pursuit. The kills officially claimed by the young American were entirely phantoms. What the terrified, disoriented pilot had perceived through the freezing mist as dying enemy fighters spiraling toward the earth were actually something far more mechanical. They were desperate Focke-Wulfs, abruptly peeling away in steep dives, their heavy radial engines suddenly sputtering as their heavily rationed fuel tanks ran completely dry. Others were tragic victims of the storm itself, veteran German pilots who succumbed to severe spatial disorientation in the whiteout conditions and blindly drove their own aircraft into the unseen granite of the mountainside. This discrepancy perfectly highlights the collision between historical truth and official military records, heavily distorted by the fog of war. In the chaotic, blinding adrenaline of a near-death encounter, where visibility is measured in feet and survival is calculated in seconds, a sudden evasive dive or a flash of atmospheric lightning reflecting off wet aluminum was easily interpreted by a panicked pilot as a confirmed kill. Intelligence officers, eager for positive combat metrics, routinely rubber-stamped these illusions. Stripping away these phantom victories reveals the true, unromanticized nature of the encounter. His survival was never a tactical victory won with armor-piercing bullets. It was a strictly logistical victory of endurance. He had simply outlasted the rigid operational margins of the Third Reich's collapsing fuel supply by aggressively weaponizing the brutal weather. But as the immediate threat of the Luftwaffe faded and he finally leveled his violently overstressed Mustang, a new, terrifying reality set in. The relentless maneuvering inside the freezing storm had burned through his own high-octane reserves at a catastrophic rate. His battle against the German pilots was over, but his own mechanical endurance was about to abruptly run out. The punishing evasive maneuvers that had saved Byers' life inside the storm had demanded relentless, high RPM throttle adjustments. Now, as the jagged peaks of the Bavarian Alps began to give way to the flatter terrain approaching the Allied lines, the mechanical toll of that survival suddenly manifested. The steady, reassuring roar of his 1,500-horsepower Packard Merlin engine abruptly broke into a violent, rhythmic shudder. The fuel pressure gauge on his instrument panel fluctuated wildly, dropping toward zero. He was scraping the absolute bottom of his internal fuselage tank, keeping the heavy fighter aloft on nothing but the residual high-octane fumes trapped in the fuel lines. But the ordeal was not entirely over. While the majority of the German interceptors had broken off to save themselves, one final hunter had refused to abort the pursuit. Trailing far behind the main formation, a single Luftwaffe pilot had pushed his supercharged Daimler-Benz engine to maximum continuous power. Ignoring the strict logistical warnings from his ground controller, he burned through his own critically low synthetic reserves in a desperate, obsessive bid to claim the isolated American. Just as Byers dropped out of the protective cover of the freezing mist, desperately scanning the snowy ground for any recognizable Allied landmark, the German broke through the ragged cloud ceiling directly on his tail. The pursuit had instantly devolved from a blind, radar-guided hunt into a terrifyingly intimate visual engagement. Byers was flying low, entirely drained of kinetic energy, dragging a dying, vibrating airframe through the dense winter air. He had absolutely no airspeed left to initiate a defensive turn. In the small rearview mirror mounted above his canopy, he could clearly see the yellow spinner of the German fighter perfectly aligning with his fuselage. The German pilot had the optimal firing solution. He had the speed, the angle, and a mathematically doomed target. But at the exact millisecond he prepared to unleash his heavy cannons, the encounter was abruptly decided by the cold, unforgiving laws of physics. His massive Daimler-Benz engine violently seized. He had consumed his final, microscopic drop of aviation fuel. The heavy propeller instantly stopped spinning, immediately transforming the lethal interceptor into a plummeting, dead weight. Stripped of all thrust and dropping rapidly toward the trees, the Luftwaffe pilot was forced to violently bank his stalled aircraft away, throw off his canopy, and bail out into the freezing wind. There was no victory roll or triumphant radio call. Left completely alone in the gray sky, Byers spent the final, terrifying minutes of the flight in a grueling physical battle just to keep his starving Mustang airborne. As the sprawling, mud-soaked perimeter of a forward Allied airstrip finally appeared on the horizon, his Packard Merlin engine gave one last, violent cough and died completely. The heavy, four-bladed propeller windmilled to a silent halt. Gliding on pure momentum, Byers slammed the heavy, silent fighter down onto the pierced steel planking, skidding to a dead stop in the freezing mud. The pursuit was over, decided not by a heroic final dogfight, but by the absolute physical limits of the machines. When Byers finally climbed out of his freezing cockpit, staring at the mud-splattered, silent Mustang resting on the steel planking, the stark reality of the European air war was laid entirely bare. The cinematic myth demands that he survived this encounter because he was a natural-born ace, an invincible American knight who fearlessly outflew and outgunned a swarming veteran enemy. But the historical documentation proves that survival in 1944 was rarely a matter of individual chivalry. He lived precisely because he was backed by a sprawling, invisible machinery of war that dwarfed any single pilot. his survival was underwritten by the massive, overwhelming American engineering budget that provided the Mustang with a fuel range the Luftwaffe simply could no longer match. It was dictated by the highly classified, real-time intervention of Allied Y-service operators huddled in distant listening posts, weaponizing intercepted telemetry. And it was ultimately enforced by the cold, logistical strangulation of the Third Reich, which sent desperate German pilots into combat with fuel tanks that were practically empty before they even took off. The conflict here is not merely between aluminum and steel. It is between the romanticized, solitary memory we prefer to celebrate and the brutal, collective reality that actually dictated who lived and who died. Stripping away the pulp magazine fictions does not diminish the sheer terror Byers faced in that cockpit. Instead, it reveals a much deeper, more complex truth about the nature of the conflict. The dogfights of the late war were no longer decided by a pilot's individual courage or mastery of the stick and rudder. They were decided by the grinding mathematics of industrialized attrition. In the freezing skies over the Third Reich, survival was rarely dictated by the trigger on a control stick. It was ultimately decided by the fuel gauge on the dashboard, the invisible radio waves cutting through the winter storms, and the relentless industrial mathematics of a war entering its final, most desperate phase. The myth of the lone flying knight makes for a beautiful story, but in the brutal reality of 1944, a pilot didn't shoot his way to salvation. He simply outlasted the enemy's dying machine.